Welcome everyone. Bienvenidos a todos.
Buenas tardes.
Hola Irma, buenas tardes.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes. Vamos a dar unos minutitos para que se unan las demás personas a la reunión y vamos a comenzar. We're just going to give it a few minutes for folks to join the meeting and then we'll get started.
Welcome everyone. Bienvenidos a todos. Just give folks a few more minutes.
In the meantime, you can dance to
Buenas
the
tardes.
music or write your own lyrics to it. Mientras esperamos pueden bailar a la música o ponerle su propia letra. You all just see me from my neck up, but my legs are dancing. Nada más me están viendo del cuello hacia arriba, pero mis piernas están bailando.
Esperamos un minuto más. We'll wait one more minute before we get started. Okay, Domingo, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you for welcome and interpretation instructions.
All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our April meeting of the Community Steering Committee for the International Border. Buenas tardes a todos y sean bienvenidos a nuestra reunión de abril del Comité Directivo de la Comunidad Internacional Fronteriza. Voy a proveer instrucciones para acceder a los canales de interpretación. Lo voy a hacer en inglés y después regreso al español. I'm going to provide instructions for joining the interpretation channels. I'll do this in English and then I'll repeat in Spanish. If you are joining us today through your tablet or your smartphone, please locate the menu with the icon of the three dots. You can click there and then you will select language interpretation. And then from there, you can select your language of choice. In this case, you would select English. If you are joining us through your computer, please locate the interpretation icon in the form of a globe at the bottom of your screen. And then from there, you can select English. And now I'm going to provide instructions in Spanish. Para las personas que nos están acompañando a través de su tableta o iPad o de su teléfono inteligente o smartphone, favor de localizar el menú con figura de 3 puntos que se encuentra en la parte superior de su pantalla y de ahí pueden elegir interpretación del lenguaje o language interpretation y enseguida pueden pulsar Spanish para español. Si nos acompañan a través de su computadora, favor de localizar el icono con forma de globo en la parte inferior de su pantalla y de ahí pueden seleccionar Spanish o español. And now we will go ahead and continue our meeting and I will turn it over to Shalem to go over the agenda for today. Welcome everybody.
Welcome, everyone. As you can see, we have quite a full agenda today, and we have a good group with us. I see a lot of community members in the room today, and then we also have a number of agency staff members, both from Air Pollution Control District, California Air Resources Board, and I also see Caltrans on as well. So today, we're actually going to scratch item number 2. Lauren was unable to make it tonight, but tomorrow expect an email from Lauren, who is the outreach specialist who you all met the last couple of meetings, and she will be emailing some draft outreach materials that you all helped inform and you've all requested, and you'll have an opportunity to provide feedback on those outreach materials so that we can recruit more community steering committee members. And so please expect an email from Lauren tomorrow regarding those draft outreach materials. We are going to start off today with a presentation from the California Air Resources Board. Melinda is here this evening to give this presentation, which will be an update regarding the state budget, so the state of California budget, and what that is looking for in terms of the AB 617 program. We're also going to have a presentation from Stephanie from the Air Pollution Control District, who will be giving a presentation on the draft 24-25 fiscal year APCD budget. So a bunch of budget conversation at the beginning of the meeting today. We'll spend the majority of our time together this evening, about an hour's worth of time. Randy and Nick from the Air Pollution Control District's rule development team will be giving a presentation and having an opportunity for a facilitated workshop discussion around the indirect source rule and or other enforceable indirect source control technologies, and they'll explain what that is. We've actually been talking about that this past year in terms of how it relates to the warehouses in Otay Mesa and San Isidro, and the heavy duty trucks that are traveling to and from. So there'll be an opportunity to learn more about that, and for you all to ask questions and also provide feedback on that. We'll then move to public comment, closing remarks, and then adjourn from that. So with that, actually, let me just let a few more people in from the waiting room before we get started. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Melinda to start off with the conversation about the state budget. And Melinda, would you like me to run your slides, or would you like to run your own slides?
I would love for you to run my slides. Thank you, Shalom.
All right, let me do that. Let me get that pulled up here. Let's see. Right. Does that look okay, Melinda?
Yeah, that looks great. So we can go ahead and get started on the next slide, actually. Yes, and I'm actually seeing that it's likely hard for you to read, but fear not, I'm going to kind of share with you what's on that slide. So if you can't see that, no worries. I will share with you what's on that. So good evening, everyone. Thank you. I'm Melinda Dumasani, and I'm the manager for implementation of the AB 617 Community Air Protection Program. And it's my pleasure to work with the San Diego and South Coast Air Districts and communities. Andrea Juarez, who is your IBC CARB liaison, was unable to join us tonight, so it's my pleasure to give you an update on the state budget. So you may have already heard about the challenges we at the state are facing in the news. It's big news. And we're definitely experiencing some significant budget challenges right now. So it's been reported in the news that we are actually facing anywhere between a $38 billion deficit to $73 billion, depending on who you ask. And that means that we in the Community Air Protection Program too will be anticipating some budget funding cuts that have already been proposed in the governor's January 10 budget. And I'll speak more about those details about those cuts shortly. But first, I want to talk to you about some recent action. In fact, this month, that has been happening with the governor and the legislature to address some of those funding challenges. So earlier this month, the governor proposed some early actions to reduce our budget deficit by 17.3 billion. And in that package, he proposed some state program cuts, internal borrowing, funding delays, and shift to savings in our state funding, current state funding. So this past Monday, tax day, on April 15th, the legislature did pass AB 106, which was the early action plan proposed by the governor to reduce the deficit by 17.3 billion. So that was just a plan to tackle part of that funding gap before the regular budget process starts off later this spring. But we anticipate more proposals for cuts in the upcoming governors may revise next month to balance our budget. So now I want to turn your attention to how this will specifically impact the funding for the Community Air Protection Program overall. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is also equally small, so I apologize. I'll explain to you what's in this slide. But in this table, the things that I kind of want you to focus in on are the numbers below. And you'll see at the end on that right-hand side, there's about $250 million proposed for the Community Air Protection Program overall. But that's a $50 million reduction from what we received last year. So that's pretty significant. And for the $250 million proposed, I'm going to break down what that means for our program. So our program is broken into 3 funding pots. And so we have implementation funds. We also have community air protection or CAP incentive funds. And then we have technical assistance, or what we commonly refer to as the community air grants funding. So those are the 3 pots. The implementation funds are given and managed by the Air District for their staffing, interpretation and facilitation services, the Community Steering Committee stipends or CSC stipends, the SERP and camp development, outreach, and equipment. So in that funding pot, $50 million is being proposed for the 35 air districts, and $60 million was provided last year. So that's a reduction of $10 million overall in the implementation funding pot. In the CAP, which is in the middle, in the CAP incentives funding pot, which are given and managed by the air districts, given to and managed by the air districts to develop and support community identified projects, clean technology and infrastructure projects, $250 million is being proposed for use, and $320 million was actually provided last year. So that's a reduction of $70 million overall to that funding pot. And lastly, the second to the last column is the community air protection funding. So that funding is given to CARB, and we administer to provide grants to community-based organizations and California Native American tribes to participate in the AB 617 Community Air Protection Program through grants that focus on community engagement and outreach into the program, community education projects, and monitoring and data collection and analysis projects. And for our program, $5 million is being proposed for the community air grants, and $6 million was provided last year. But what I want to also point out is that prior to last year, when the state was facing a $32 billion deficit, the community air grants funding was typically around $10 million for the program for a year. So that means that we are anticipating some real challenges with the proposed $250 million overall for the program. So bottom line, that means that we'll have to think creatively about how we provide the same level of support with less funding resources. So there's more in store, we know, in the governor's revise that's coming out next month to balance the rest of the budget. So I'll just say stay tuned and thank you.
Thank you so much, Melinda. I appreciate you sharing this information with us. And I know it's a little bit small, probably a little bit small on the screen, especially if you're using your phone this evening, but we'll definitely have this posted on our website under the International Border Steering Committee page. And we can also email out this presentation to folks too, in case folks want to dive into that. And so hopefully we'll have some better news in May once there's a revise. And so we look forward to continuing the conversation on that. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here.
And also, Shalem, what we can do, I'll ask my team to revise the slide a little bit to make the font a little bit bigger. So if that's helpful, I can certainly provide that to you maybe tomorrow even.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Melinda. Before we transition to Stephanie, who will be sharing about the APCD's budget, I just want to see if folks have any questions or comments regarding the state budget and Melinda's presentation. All right. I know Melinda and her team are very accessible as well. And so if any questions come up or comments come up as well, feel free to let us know, and we could certainly connect you with Melinda and her team, and they'll be able to answer those questions. I think with that as well, Melinda, I guess one of my big questions is, are there opportunities for community members to advocate in terms of what their priorities are for the state budget?
Absolutely. So if you are in contact with your respective legislators, you absolutely can let them know how you feel about the program and the proposed funding cuts, just to kind of get a sense of like where your priorities are and how strongly you may feel about a cut, a particular funding cut either way. So I think it's helpful for your leaders to understand, where your priorities are, and advocate those in the legislature. Absolutely. Thank you, Shalom.
Yeah. Thanks, Melinda. Just going to do last look here and see if anyone has any questions or comments on this agenda item. And that's something I'd love to also continue the conversation on, and we can certainly provide information on who the elected officials are in the Assembly and the State Senate as well, if folks want to continue that advocacy and share with folks what this program means to them as well. So, all right, thank you so much, Melinda. I'm going to go ahead and transition to Stephanie. And Stephanie, Mike said he will be running your slides, and there he is.
Thanks. Thank you, Shalom. All right. So hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Nicholas. I am the Chief of Support Services Division with SDAPCD, and just want to thank you for allowing me to give this presentation tonight. I'm going to be talking about our proposed fiscal year 24-25, what we call our recommended budget. Next slide, please.
I apologize to interrupt. I just want to, Mike, you might want to make it slideshow view, because we're seeing the notes.
You're testing the limits of my technical expertise here. Let me see if I can give it another shot here.
Thank you.
How's that?
Perfect. Okay, so tonight we are going to be just kind of going to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about in this presentation. So I'm going to provide just a reminder of what the district's goals and objectives are, a look forward at what our fiscal year 24-25 recommended budget looks like, what our fund balance usage, our projected fund balance usage looks like, some of our staffing, proposed staffing, the Office of Environmental Justice budget, and then going to finish by providing some upcoming dates related to the budget process. Next slide. So our goals and objectives remain the same as they are today. As part of our recommended budget, we will continue to expand upon our programs to promote our goals of air quality, public health, environmental justice and equity, public engagement and transparency, and operational excellence. These goals and objectives were weaved into the budget development process to ensure that we advance the district's vision of clean air for all and our mission to improve air quality to protect public health and the environment. Next slide, please. So a few, just kind of give you a sneak peek here, a few highlights from the recommended budget include $120.2 million in revenues and expenditures are being proposed for fiscal year 24-25. Of that $120.2 million, $60 million is for pass-through grants to incentivize projects that accelerate air quality and public health improvements, including $34 million specifically for projects benefiting disadvantaged communities. We've included in the budget $1 million in EPA grant funding to expand engagement with multiple communities throughout the region in air quality awareness, monitoring, planning, and advocacy. We've also included funding for some additional air quality monitoring sites planned in Escondido, National City, Imperial Beach, San Ysidro, and Otay Mesa. And as part of the budget, we are reducing our reliance on the use of fund balance to the district operations and one-time projects. And I'll get into the exact definition of fund balance later in the presentation. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the majority of what the budget's about here. So as I mentioned, we're recommending a budget of $120.2 million. It's a balanced budget, and it's being proposed for the upcoming fiscal year 24-25, which runs, it runs from July 1st, 2024 through June 30, 2025. So a breakdown of our budget's website a breakdown of our budget can be found on our website. But some of the highlights of the budget include an operating budget of $41.9 million and a special revenue fund budget of $78.3 million, totaling that $120.2. The operating budget is strictly for the operations of the Air Pollution Control District and does not include budget amounts for special revenue funds, so things like the pass-through grants to pay for incentives. The operating budget plans for revenue and expenditures to run the main programs of the district, such as administrative services, monitoring and source testing, compliance, engineering, mobile incentives, and rule development. The largest chunk of the recommended budget, $60 million, or about 46.5% of the total, is for pass-through grants to incentivize projects that accelerate air quality and public health. And as I mentioned before, this includes $34 million in AB 617 funding specifically for projects in disadvantaged communities. The second largest chunk of expenditures or spending is $29.5 million, or just under 23% of the total budget for salaries and benefits, which throughout the presentation I'll refer to as S&B. And that's for what we are recommending of 178 staff positions, including all negotiated labor agreement increases, health benefits, workers' comp, retirement, and that 178 includes us proposing one new position. Another expenditure source, $17.6 million, or 13.7% of the budget, is for what we call operating transfers out. This is kind of a weird category, so I'm going to do my best to explain it here. So it reflects the spending or the expenditure side of the transfer of money between district funds. So I mentioned before, we have our operating kind of fund, and then we have some of our special revenue funds. So it's the transfer of money between those. And this accounts for the reimbursement and transfer of money between all special revenue funds. So our AB 617 fund, DMV, Moyer, et cetera, all to our operating fund. An example of this would be transferring of the costs that the SDAPCD incurs related to AB 617. So it's the administrative costs, the overhead costs for staff to monitor and measure air pollutants and improve air quality in the communities that are disproportionately impacted by air pollution. So this is kind of a government accounting where we have to account for that overhead in its kind of own special category and the transfer of that money between the special revenue funds to the operating funds. And then we have a 15.2 million, or just under 12% of the budget, is for what we call services and supplies, and I'll refer to S&S throughout the presentation. This includes costs the district is responsible for outside of salaries and benefits, such as our fleet, so our fleet vehicles, the maintenance of those vehicles, building maintenance, office equipment, any educational materials we prepare and distribute, or the translation services, things like that. And that services and supplies, or S&S, also includes that funding for the additional monitoring stations that I mentioned that we are proposing for fiscal year 24-25. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the budget is balanced, which means our expenditures, which I just talked about, are 120.2. So our revenues are equal to that 120.2 million for fiscal year 24-25. The largest source of our revenue is intergovernmental revenues, which is just under 85 million, or 70% of the revenue. That means revenue from other governmental agencies. So these sources are state and federal funds, most of which is pass-through funding for projects to improve air quality and public health in communities throughout the region. And then a small portion of that grant funds are used to help offset some of the district costs to implement various clean air programs and are not passed through as incentives. The grant agreements in these cases usually dictate how we can reimburse for work done under those agreements, so pretty strict requirements on how that revenue is spent. And the second primary source of revenue is what we call other financing sources, which I mentioned both in the previous slide that operating transfers out. That's the expenditure category. So this other financing sources is the equivalent of that on the revenue side. So again, it's that transferring of funds between transferring of money, between district funds. And so an example of this is transferring grant monies allocated for administrative costs and staff overhead to implement and oversee the AB 617 program. And then the last category that I'll talk about is our license permits and franchises. It's about 10%, or 11.4 million. And what that means, license permits and franchises, is the revenue derived from our permit applications, permit renewal fees, and fees paid by customers specifically for district services. This is fee-related revenue, and it can only be used to cover the costs of the services provided by the district to the permit holder. Next slide, please. So earlier I mentioned the word fund balance. So fund balance is kind of thought of as like a savings account. It's a finite resources, right? What you put in is what you can use. There's no money coming from anywhere unless you're putting money in. So the other side of that is, once the money is spent, it's gone. It doesn't come back unless we would put more money in that. So we have a couple different, we have 4 different buckets of savings account. The first one is called the Operations General Fund, and this is a discretionary savings account that should be used for one-time projects, not ongoing, because the funding here is not ongoing. So in the past several years, we've had to use this fund to cover some revenue shortfalls in our operating budget. And for the first time, as part of our 24-25 budget in many years, we are not proposing to use any funds, any monies from this fund to cover any revenue shortfalls. With that being said, the budget is built on projections. So if we don't realize the revenue that we have projected, there's the possibility we could always need to tap into that general fund to cover any potential revenue gaps. Then we also have a bucket, let's call it, called operating reserves. This is a committed account, meaning that we can only use money in this account with our governing board's approval and for a very specific purpose. This is money set aside to maintain 2 months worth of operating expenditures in case of unforeseen economic shortfalls. Similarly, the facilities and fleet fund is again committed, so we can only use this money for specific fleet and facility uses, and we have to have approval from our governing board to do that. And then we have our financial and data management system replacement and upgrade. Again, a committed fund requires governing board approval. And this would be used for financial or data management system upgrades or replacements as necessary. So computer software we use to either our permitting system or our financial system, whatever the case may be. And then lastly, the last fund is called the DMV fund. It's used to support the district's mobile source related program, such as funding for incentive projects that directly reduce emissions from vehicles and equipment. And so this chart, the blue bar on this chart represents the current projected balance that we think we will have at the end of the current fiscal year. The green part of the bar represents either additions or subtractions from each of the funds. So as part of the 24-25 budget, although we are not recommending using any of the operations general fund to cover revenue shortfalls, what we are recommending is to take $900,000 from that fund and to redistribute it to other committed funds. So if we do that, it will leave the general fund with about $6.4 million. And then we would reallocate the $900,000 that we took from there as follows. We put $350,000 into our operating reserve. We are required by our governing board to have 2 months worth of operating reserve. So putting that 350 would put us at our projected balance of 5.2 million, which is just about 2 months of operating reserves. We are proposing to put 300,000 to our facilities fund for a total balance of $1 million. And 250 to financial and data management system for a total balance of $3 million. And we are not proposing any changes to the DMV fund. Next slide, please. So as part of the 24-25 recommended budget, to ensure that critical services are provided and to meet our goals and objectives, we are proposing the addition of one new staff position. We're recommending an air pollution control aide in our monitoring division. This is to support the expansion of our BioWatch program to include Camp Pendleton. This position would be funded 100% by a federal Department of Homeland Security BioWatch grant. And for budgetary purposes, you will see a reduction in the staffing numbers in our monitoring division of 5 staff. However, this is not a true reduction in staffing. It's what it is a movement for, and this again is for budgetary purposes only. It's a movement of 6 existing staff positions from one budgetary unit, our monitoring division, to another, our environmental justice. And then adding that one position that I just talked about gives it a net reduction for budget purposes of 5 in that division. And then additionally, the increased work of SDAPCD in our local environmental justice communities has enhanced the work of our Office of Environmental Justice, which for budget purposes was previously incorporated into the program budgets for other divisions. It was administration and monitoring. And so we, again, for budgeting and just being able to be more transparent, we are creating, and just kind of making sure we have a good view of the funding being allocated for environmental justice efforts. We are requesting a new budgetary unit called Office of Environmental Justice. And we are proposing to transfer in budget 3 existing staff from administration for program management, outreach, engagement, and more, which I'll cover in the next slide. And then those 6 staff from monitoring that I talked about before, specifically for community air monitoring. Next slide, please. So environmental justice is incorporated into all that we do as a district, from the processing of grant payments to compliance, providing education and outreach, to ensuring regulated entities understand how to comply with air quality regulations. The budgetary unit of Office of Environmental Justice, as noted on the previous slide, is being recommended with 3 dedicated staff members to focus on that outreach, program administration, things like that. The cost of those staff is roughly $500,000 in salary and benefits, or S&B. And the focus of those folks is going to specifically be on the implementation of the Office of Environmental Justice framework, cultivating environmental justice partnerships, implementation of the International Border and Portside SERPs, community outreach and education, and then the San Diego Tijuana Quality Task Force creation. Also included in the budget for Office of Environmental Justice are S&S costs, and that's some of those included in S&S are community-based organization and community stipends, some sensor-based monitors, interpretation and translation, facilitation consultants, and the preparation and distribution of educational materials. Next slide, please. So the district's environmental justice program, so not the budgetary unit that I talked about, but the program has two main funding sources. We have a government to government, or what I'll refer to moving forward as G2G grant, which comes from the EPA, and then we have state funding from CARB, which you heard a little bit about in the presentation before mine. So these funding sources cover work being done by several budgetary units to support environmental justice efforts, including that budgetary unit of Office of Environmental Justice. Monitoring or mobile incentives, and it incorporates department-wide overhead as well. So the G2G grant is a 2-year grant for a total of $1 million. So what that means is it's a one-time grant. We got $1 million, but it needs to cover 2 years worth of time. So we are budgeting the full amount. We are recommending to budget the full amount in fiscal year 24-25. However, that money, like I said, is intended to last through fiscal year 25-26. So whatever we do not spend in this next fiscal year, we would carry that forward into 25-26. So it lasts the full 2 years. This funding will be spent on, staff salary and benefits, S&S, including the purchase and distribution of sensor-based monitors, indoor air purifiers, indoor air quality monitors, as well as outreach, education, and engagement. And then a big chunk of this, about $380,000, will be spent for CBOs, or that community-based organizations, for outreach, project recruitment, and project implementation categories. And then that second funding source, state funding from CARB, within that, there's 2 buckets of AB 617 funding. As Melinda had said earlier, there's the implementation and the incentive grant funding. So we are, as part of our 24-25 budget, we are recommending $4.4 million for the AB 617 implementation portion. And that grant, that money is comprised of $2.3 million in ongoing grant funding. I say ongoing, but that is evaluated at the state level annually, so it could change. And then the other $2.1 million is made up of one-time funding that we received, meaning we got that money as a one-time allocation, and once it's gone, there is no ongoing revenue identified moving forward. So this funding is for both AB 617 environmental justice communities, in addition to supporting and cultivating relationships with other communities impacted by environmental harms who don't currently have a CERP or associated funding. So I think it's important to note that, that funding has to cover, Portside International Border and other communities as well. And then lastly, there is just under $36 million for the AB 617 incentive grants that we are proposing as part of the recommended budget. Most of this, as I mentioned at the very beginning, $34 million is pass-through grants, so going directly to folks in the communities receiving the funds to incentivize projects that accelerate air quality and public health improvements, specifically projects benefiting disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. And so this, everything I've said is an overview of what we are proposing to recommend for fiscal year 24-25 budget. I want to just start out by saying thank you again for allowing me to share a little bit about our budget and the information contained in it, but also want to just give you some updates on some upcoming dates that you may be interested in if you want to participate. So we released our budget to our website, and the URL towards the bottom of the slide has kind of our budget document, as well as some detailed information about the budget that you can review at your leisure. And then coming up on May 9th at 5 p.m., we'll present our recommended budget to the governing board. And then on June 13th, budget deliberations by the governing board will take place. And then if you would like to provide any feedback regarding our budget, you can send us an email to the email address at the bottom of the screen there. And with that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was a really helpful breakdown of the budget. I just want to see if folks have any questions or comments regarding the draft budget for the Air Pollution Control District. Just see, oh, I see hand, Alejandro.
Hi everyone. Is the like with the proposed budgets and expected like incentive amount, do we have like a maybe like an estimate of how much like greenhouse gas reductions we're looking at, or anything like that kind of analysis, or how many projects we will be able to implement?
I can take a stab at that, Alejandro. Mike Watt, one of the deputy directors here at ABC, and I've got Kathy Kean on the line who might be able to help us as well. Essentially, what we do with those funds is put out a solicitation for projects, which we recently did. I think it just closed within the last week. And so the team will be evaluating those project solicitations to determine, which ones are eligible for AB 617 funding, which ones provide benefits to Portside, International Border, or the other communities that are eligible for those funds. And then based on the cost effectiveness or the amount of emission reductions per dollar spent, we'll prioritize those projects. And then those projects recommendations will be brought back before the International Border Community and the Portside Steering Committee to provide feedback and input on, how those dollars are spent. So we're probably several months away from that, given the significant dollar amounts that we've received and the number of evaluations that the staff is working through. So it's difficult at this point to kind of give a number as to what we'd be looking at, either in dollars spent or emission reductions. But that information will be forthcoming and be brought back to the steering committees when we've got it together. So hopefully that helps. Kathy, I'm not sure if I missed anything, but feel free to augment or correct.
No, you got it just right, Mike. Yeah, we're early days yet, but we will be coming back to the committee to talk about the applications we received and what kind of emission reductions we might expect from those projects.
Sorry, and follow-up question real quick. That's completely understandable. So when those projects are being scored or like evaluated, would this committee have an influence on that decision?
Well, yes, you already have, actually. As part of this committee, the AB 617 committees help us set the priorities for how that money is spent. So we've definitely heard from this committee about the desire to go to zero emission equipment, for example, the need for infrastructure to happen so we can incentivize that change. So all of that input that we've received from the communities is going into the project selection process.
Just to kind of also kind of connect the dots too, essentially what Kathy is saying as well is everything that has been mentioned as part of the community emission reduction program that you all helped develop is also framing the priorities for the types of projects that would score much higher as part of that process. And to Mike's earlier point, that kind of scoring process and the projects for consideration would come back to both Portside and International Border Committee before those funds are spent for this committee's fee. And Domingo, did you want to add to that as well?
Not necessarily to this point. I just saw a question on the chat that I wanted to address, but I see that Melinda already responded, so I think we're good.
Awesome. And so was that the question that Nicholas Paul had?
Correct, about the difference between implementation and incentive funding.
Yeah. I'm going to read it out loud just so that the interpreters can capture that as well on the Spanish channel. So Nicholas Paul said, can you repeat what is the difference between the AB 617 implementation and AB 617 incentive grants? Melinda from CARB said, implementation funds are given to and managed by the air districts for their staffing, interpretation, and facilitation services, CSC stipends, SERP and camp development, and outreach and equipment. And then And then Melinda goes on to say CAP incentives funding are given to and managed by the air districts to develop and support community identified projects, clean technologies, and infrastructure projects. And I also want to uplift a question by Jenny, who says that does the state or AB 517 card budget, or I think she means AB 617 card budget, affect the new monitoring stations mentioned near the IBC region? And Domingo, or do you want to handle that one?
Sure, I can certainly do that. Yes, it does, because we have, as I was mentioned earlier, this funding is for not just the international border community, but also our portside community and potentially other communities throughout the region. We do have a camp in place for both portside and the international border. And so large, in large part, the implementation of that camp, of that community air monitoring plan, depends on the available funding for the program. And so we have basically received the same amount of funding to implement the program in both communities. We recently received one-time funding that will help support some of these efforts, but that was just one time. And so it will be very important for us to continue advocating for additional funds to support this program so that we can fully implement and continue to maintain all of the efforts that we've been working on with these two communities. And as you probably saw in the budget, just staffing wise, for example, a large part of the staffing that this AB 617 funds help support is dedicated to monitoring. Monitoring is very resource intensive, both in terms of equipment and staffing. And so to add to your question, Jenny, I think that this really highlights the importance of continued support for funding for this program.
Then Jenny asked a follow-up question. Have you decided which monitoring stations will be prioritized?
I think that's something that we're still ongoing conversation with this group and also internally at APCD. Part of it is not only the prioritization by the community, but also our ability to secure the sites where the community would like to see those monitoring efforts take place. And so I know that we've been working with some partner entities to deploy sensor-based monitoring, and this is more related to the odors and that are coming from the Tijuana River, but also looking at other sites for some of the other pollutants that we are planning to monitor. So it's a bit of a combination between getting the input from the community, but then also our ability to secure the sites.
And I just want to elaborate a little bit on that in terms of the ability to secure the sites, meaning that some of the monitors require power, so being able to be plugged in. Some of the monitors, or for example, if a school was identified, being able to communicate with the principal and operation and services to make sure it's placed in a place where it's safe and all. And so there's a lot of factors that go in to securing a site. So in the community air monitoring plan, the camp, there was a really nice chart, and if I could find it quickly, I'll put it in the chat box during the next presentation, that had kind of a list of all the priority sites that you all developed. All of that entire list, David and Kevin in monitoring and their team are looking at each of those sites to kind of determine the feasibility of that, and build those partnerships with those groups that we need to in order to locate the equipment. Yeah. Any other questions or comments regarding Stephanie's presentation? All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And as Stephanie mentioned, there's going to be more opportunities to comment on this draft APCD budget. And if Stephanie, if you can might put in the chat box what those opportunities are. I know that there's a budget hearing coming up in May. And also you can also submit your comments via email as well if you'd like. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Nick and Randy in who are part of APCD's rule development team. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up the presentation for them. 1 second. All right. Can you all see my screen okay?
Yeah, we can see it, just not in presentation mode, I think.
Getting there. Is it
There we
there?
go. Yep.
All right, I'll let you all take it from here.
All right. Thank you, Shalem. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nick Cormier, supervisor of the Rule Development Section at the San Diego County Air Pollution Control District. Joining me today is Randy Constellation, associate engineer in Rule Development. As was mentioned earlier, this presentation is going to provide an informational update on a potential indirect source rule, or ISR, and other emission control strategies for heavy-duty trucks in the international border area and countywide. We'll also be providing an update on discussions that we've been having as part of our Warehouse Working Group, or WWG, which we highly encourage members to participate in and share your feedback in as well. So next slide. All right. This is an overview of what we're going to be covering in today's presentation. We're going to be covering quite a lot of ground today. We'll have some grounding and refresher information about what an indirect source of emissions is. We'll have a brief recap of our June 2023 Governing Board meeting, where staff presented the ISR framework document and proposed possible pathways to take, as well as the corresponding strategy that was included in the IBC SERP, adopted by the steering committee in December and passed by the governing board in March. We'll present where warehouses are located in the county as well as in the IBC, and discuss what we can do and can't do regarding the district's legal authority over indirect sources of emissions. We'll then provide a summary of what's been discussed in WWG meetings to date. We'll discuss some of the regulatory and non-regulatory topics that are pertinent to the discussion overall, including things to consider, concepts being explored, as well as timelines for things moving forward. We'll then conclude the presentation by including some additional resources for more information. The goal today is to summarize about 12 hours of discussions that have been already taken place in today's presentation of about an hour, and also to obtain feedback from the steering committee members today about where we're heading. We'll have 4 built-in multiple question and answer sessions in the agenda, which are denoted with the blue chat icons on the slide. Next slide, please. So as a refresher, what is an indirect source of emissions? The Clean Air Act defines an indirect source as a facility, building, structure, installation, real property, road, or highway which attracts or may attract mobile sources of pollution. Assembly Bill 423 directed the district to consider adopting an indirect source rule to address air pollution from mobile sources that are associated with stationary sources, such as ports, warehouses, and distribution centers. The picture on the right side of the slide illustrates points in which emissions are generated from mobile equipment operating at stationary sources. Next slide, please. As directed by AB 423, the district is in the process of considering a possible ISR rulemaking for warehouses and distribution centers. At the June 2023 Governing Board meeting, the board approved staff's recommendation, requested action 1A, to convene a working group of community and industry stakeholders. The Warehouse Working Group, or WWG, was set up to provide input on possible regulatory and non-regulatory strategies that could further reduce indirect sources of emissions from warehouses and distribution centers in San Diego County. The working group would serve as a more structured platform than the individual stakeholder meetings held to date, to bring relevant parties together to discuss potential regulatory and alternative strategies, which include incentive programs potentially focused on smaller warehouses in impacted areas. While the WWG explores these alternatives, Staff will continue to track the South Coast AQMD litigation to ensure that the outcome is accounted for in any possible regulatory approach pursued locally. And we'll cover that a little bit more in the presentation today. As part of its direction, the board instructed staff to prioritize under-resourced communities, consider smaller warehouses of under 100,000 square feet, and return to the October 2023 board meeting with a proposed timeline for action and composition of the working group, which you'll also hear about today. As part of the steering committee's work for the International Border SERP, the CSC voted to include Strategy 5 in the plan, which was to support the development of an ISR and/or other enforceable indirect source control strategies to reduce emissions from heavy-duty trucks. The SERP, as a reminder, was adopted by the CSC in December 2023 and was unanimously adopted by the governing board in March 2024. Next slide, please. This map shows the inventory and locations of the approximately 6,700 warehouses located throughout San Diego County, ranging in size from less than 1,000 to 3.3 million square feet in size. It's important to note that not all of these buildings may be involved in warehousing activities that result in indirect source emissions. For example, a space shown on the map may be used instead as a gymnasium, office, or other operation not conducting warehousing activity. As such, this is something the district will need to further refine as part of the emission reduction strategy development process. Additional information that will be needed from these facilities include operator name, nature of their operation, and the number of truck trips occurring there. The next slide will show a zoomed-in map of the international border community to better show the scale of warehouses throughout the area. Next slide, please. This map shows the locations of approximately 302 warehouses that are within the IBC. There are about 46 warehouses with floor area of 100,000 square feet or more, 56 warehouses between 50 and 100,000 square feet, and 200 warehouses that are smaller than 50,000 square feet in size. Many of these are concentrated around the 905 corridor adjacent to the Otay Mesa Port of Entry crossing. Next slide, please. Navigating what the district can and can't do when it comes to regulating indirect sources of emissions, such as warehouses, at the local level is a complicated and legally complex process. At present time, there is only one example that has been put in place in the Los Angeles-based South Coast Air Quality Management District, and that approach could still be challenged legally moving forward. Generally speaking, the California Health and Safety Code provides the district with the primary authority to do certain actions. Other authorities are only granted to state and federal entities like the California Air Resources Board and the EPA. Health and Safety Code provides local air districts the authority to control air pollution from all sources except emissions from motor vehicles. It also includes the ability to adopt rules to meet state and federal air quality standards and reduce or mitigate emissions from air pollution from indirect sources, provided such actions are not superseded by existing federal statutes. San Diego County is in non-attainment for federal and state ozone standards and state PM 2.5 standards, with the potential to be non-attainment for federal PM 2.5 standards in the very near future. State law gives local air districts the authority to adopt and enforce rules and regulations to achieve state and federal ambient air quality standards. Federal law sets federal ambient air quality standards, but gives the states broad discretion to determine how to meet those standards. Federal law recognizes that states have independent authority to adopt an indirect source review program, and that a state may choose to submit an ISR program as part of their state implementation plan, or SIP. Next slide, please. However, a major component of the district's work on indirect sources is predicated on what the district cannot do from a legal standpoint on indirect sources of emissions, some of which we have highlighted on this slide. While the district has the authority to adopt an ISR per state and federal laws, there are limits to that authority. States and their subdivisions cannot adopt rules and regulations that are preempted by existing federal regulations, such as the Clean Air Act, whereas a local air district cannot adopt a motor vehicle emission standard. The Federal Aviation Administration Authorization Act, whereas a local air district cannot adopt a regulation that relates to price, route, or service of motor carriers. And other actions that could affect many other federal statutes like the Airline Deregulation Act, Federal Aviation Act, and Energy Policy Conservation Act, to name a few. In addition to federal preemption, the district's authority cannot interfere with California Proposition 26, which mandates that any fee component in a rule cannot be considered a tax because that would require a vote of the people and cannot be considered an improper regulatory fee. The district's authority also cannot interfere with local, city, or county control over land use decisions. As you can see, pursuing a rulemaking affecting indirect sources of emissions is substantially more complicated than a typical district rulemaking, where such federal preemptions are not a factor. Any potential ISR rulemaking is also further complicated by overlapping state regulations that currently require zero-emission trucks, such as the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation at the state level, as well as existing litigation for similar rules found elsewhere. Both topics you'll hear more about later in the presentation today. Next slide, please. So now we'd like to pause the presentation for the first time to take any questions or comments that you may have at this time. We'd like to know, are there any concepts shared that you need more description or clarification on thus far? Also, after hearing this grounding information, what other general questions or comments would you like to share with the group? Feel free to raise your hand at the bottom of the screen of the Zoom screen, or you can use the chat feature to go ahead and ask your questions at this time as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, Jose.
Yeah. And thank you for the presentation, Nick. For me, still not very clear how this effort complements other local or state efforts. It was really hard. There's a lot of limitations that what you can do and not do. So yeah, I'm sorry, but I just couldn't get it, like exactly what you're trying to achieve. What type of regulations are you looking at? Can you give us some examples of maybe best practices? You also mentioned non-regulatory efforts. So what type of those efforts are you looking at? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Jose, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I think we're going to be covering a couple of things, and later, this is kind of the first of a 4-part series in the presentation. So I think we'll probably be able to give you some context on what things we're thinking about, both in the regulatory side of things as well as the non-regulatory. But I think just to put in short, I mean, we're really trying to reduce heavy-duty truck emissions from warehouses and distribution centers in San Diego County. And what we're trying to do and work through in this working group is, what's the best way to do that in San Diego County that is within our authority to do at the local level. And that could be a rulemaking that would require a warehouse facility to, let's say, pick from a menu of options that one of the options may be to, purchase a zero emission truck. Another option could be, having trucks that are zero emission only come to your facility. Or potentially putting in a mitigation fee if you can't do that. So there's things that we're exploring right now as part of that working group to see what kind of fit would work best within the constraints that we have in order to do that. And kind of overlapping with what we can do on the local end is things that are happening at the state level and at the federal level, which are going to be further reducing emissions from trucks, both statewide and at the federal level, with regulations that they've passed. So that's kind of in a nutshell. We're going to be touching on some of those things throughout throughout the remaining portion of the presentation, but hopefully that helps encapsulate it a little bit. I see Irma's hand, and then I see a question from Penelope. I'm not sure who was first. I think we'll go with Irma.
Buenas tardes, soy yo, Irma. Mi pregunta es, yo ahorita tengo 2 carros que están parados porque no es el catalizador el por qué no pasa, porque no avientan humo. ¿Y hay algún programa? ¿Será porque están viejitos? ¿O hay algún programa que recoge el estado de California los carros que ya no pasan? Esa es mi pregunta.
Yeah, so we weren't hearing the interpretation, I think, come through the English channel, but I will try to describe what Irma said. She was saying that she has 2 vehicles that aren't in service. And so she was wondering if there's any programs for vehicles. And Domingo, do you want to add anything else to that?
Yes, thank you, Shalom. I think that was in essence the question. Irma was wondering about her 2 vehicles that yeah, basically just trying to figure out if there are any
Sí,
incentive opportunities.
Sure, I can attempt it. I
sí,
guess
que si hay alguna oportunidad, porque pues no me pasan el smog, pero no es el catalizador, son otras piezas, pero no avientan humo.
So Irma was wondering because her 2
No
vehicles were
sé,
not.
no sé ni dónde hacerlo, o hay algún programa del estado de California que recoge los carros cuando ya no pasan. Eso es lo que es mi pregunta. Si hay algún programa que recoge los carros cuando ya no pasan.
Okay, voy a intentar traducir un poco, Irma. Irma was asking if there's a state program that picks up or that collects vehicles that are no longer passing the smog check requirement in California.
yeah,
Nick, I could
oh,
jump
go
in
ahead,
on that
Kathy.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say there is a state program through the Bureau of Automotive Repair. And I can put that information in the chat. So there is, for cars that don't run anymore, there is a program through the state. Was it cars or trucks for Imra?
Cars.
Cars. Okay. Yeah, I'll put that in the chat.
No, es una troca 2002 y un carro 2002.
It's a pickup.
Una troca regular, no comercial. Comercial no, regular.
It's a pickup truck and a passenger vehicle.
Okay. I'll put some information in the chat for you on that.
Ok, muchas gracias. Muy buena información.
Gracias, Irma.
Thank you. And then I think I see a question from Jenny Quintana, if we're listing mechanisms by which APC can reduce pollution from warehouses. And then we are going to be covering a little bit about that further in the presentation. So I think I'll go ahead and temporarily postpone answering in that question. So I think we'll go ahead and move on to the next section. And for that, I will go ahead and now turn it over to Randy, who will be walking us through the next portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Nick. This slide lists communities, groups, stakeholders, agencies, and associations that have participated in at least one WWG meeting to date. Note that this list is not comprehensive, and other stakeholders not shown here have been invited but may not have yet participated in a meeting. The WWG is composed of key local community, environmental, industrial, and government stakeholders interested in the freight and warehousing sectors, community health, and air quality. The group by design was set up to hear from varying perspectives from both community and affected stakeholders. Staff has collaborated with organizations and individuals who had previously expressed interest in the topic and contacted the Mexican consulate and organizations based in Tijuana to participate. WWG meetings are open to the public, so interested parties are welcome to attend and provide their feedback either during the meetings or to staff at any point. We encourage any participants in the steering committee today to actively engage and participate in these meetings moving forward. We're happy to hear from you and get your feedback. The meetings are held from 3 o'clock to 5 p.m. on the first Monday of the month, with the next meeting scheduled for May 6th. If you are unable to attend a meeting, the recordings, agendas, and presentations of each meeting are posted on the district's WWG webpage, usually the day after each meeting, so you can review them on your own time. Next slide, please. To date, 6 WWG meetings have been conducted, which produced about 12 hours of discussions, learning sessions, and important feedback on aspects brought up by the governing board, community members, or areas that need more analysis. The meetings are intended to provide time for in-depth discussions with interested stakeholders on specific ISR topics. These next 3 slides highlight some of the comments received at the meetings. We encourage steering committee members to review the recordings of the WWG meetings to better understand the agenda topics and the context of the comments. During the WWG orientation meeting on September 25th, we discussed direction from the governing board to consider an ISR for ports, warehouses, and distribution centers. Other meeting items included WWG expectations, stakeholder input, meeting topics, format, and scheduling. Some comments received at the orientation meeting include: staff should develop a plan for public outreach to warehouses. Non-regulatory strategies should be explored and developed first, which may aid the development of regulatory approaches to follow. Implementation costs and emission reductions should be evaluated. The emission reductions impact from various CARB regulations should also be evaluated. Consideration of the potential localized health benefits that may occur from developed strategies, even if regional reductions may be minor. And finally, to keep SERP goals in mind and potentially using monitoring data being procured from that effort to determine if any possible strategies would be working. At our first kickoff meeting of the WWG in November 2023, the meeting included a discussion on the warehouse inventory, the district's legal authority to adopt an ISR, and other possible non-regulatory strategies to reduce emissions. Some comments received at the kickoff meeting include: smaller warehouses should be included in the ISR, concerns about what is not known at this time, for example, relationship between warehouse activities and DPM emissions, how do warehouse emissions compare with other diesel sources, and which are the highest emitters and by how much. The alternative strategies that were considered but ultimately rejected by South Coast AQMD during the development of their Rule 2305 should also be considered for San Diego. And what is the timeline for the ISR development? Next slide, please. At the December 2023 meeting, discussion items include an overview of the district's rule development process, various definitions of a warehouse employed in other regions, and possible non-regulatory strategies under consideration at the time. Some comments received at the meeting include: district should determine the need for an ISR based on available emissions data and accounting for CARB regulations, and the benefits and compliance costs of an ISR before working on rule language. There is concern that an ISR would limit truck trips and thus adversely affect commerce. Stakeholders thought providing an exemption for low truck volume facilities would be appropriate. And finally, potentially developing an incentive program that would benefit both warehouse operators and truck fleet owners. On the January WWG meeting, discussion items include update on the status of the South Coast AQMD Warehouse Rule 2305 litigation, a presentation by CARB staff on their various mobile source regulations, and an overview of the appointment system pilot project at the Calexico East Point of Entry and how that may fit in with any possible ISR if developed in San Diego County, which we'll highlight in subsequent slides. Some comments received at the meeting include concerns about ZEV implementation and timing, such as electrical grid capacity and construction of charging infrastructure, the need for enhanced enforcement of existing CARB regulations, for example, the truck and bus regulation, possible negative or positive impacts of a cargo reservation system, and discussions with trucking companies and warehouse owners, operators for their feedback on potential strategies to incentivize the transition to ZE equipment. Next slide, please. At the February meeting, discussion items include a presentation by Caltrans staff discussing aspects of the proposed project for the Calexico East Port of Entry Joint Operations System and how a similar project in Otay Mesa could be interwoven with our strategies to reduce emissions from warehouses here, a listening session with warehouse tenants, companies that lease land to warehouse tenants, as well as trucking companies in the border area, to better understand what kind of incentive program might work best to suit their needs, and information on how South Coast allows companies to count truck visits to comply with their Rule 2305. Some comments received at the meeting include warehouse tenants do not own truck fleets nor control the trucks going in and out of warehouses. Many products from Mexico are delivered to a drop yard instead of a prototypical warehouse. Most tenants contract with independent truckers to pick up products from drop yards for delivery throughout the U.S. The district should focus on these operators to assist with incentive funding. Emissions reduced from the implementation of an appointment system may be more than those that may be realized through an ISR. Thus, the appointment system should be prioritized over an ISR. And logistical challenges to tracking truck trips. Few buildings with a guard shack, warehouse operators do not have access to GPS tracking data. Finally, the most recent WWG meeting was held in March. The April meeting was canceled due to scheduling availability. Discussion items in March include how to address one of the directives the district received from the governing board in our June 2023 board meeting, which was how the district may prioritize impacted communities in our ISR work, the results of how companies are complying with South Coast AQMD's Rule 2305 by looking at some data from their first year of implementation, which you'll hear more about today, an introduction of a proposed incentive funding concept the district plans on moving ahead with as far as our non-regulatory strategy. Some comments received at the meeting include an ISR should prioritize warehouses located in disadvantaged communities that are within 1,000 feet of a nearby sensitive receptor. The majority of truck crossings at Otay Mesa are from Mexican carriers domiciled in Mexico. However, there is currently no charging or fueling infrastructure for ZE trucks in Mexico and will not be built for many years. Let's consider low NOx or natural gas as an interim option for cleaner technology until ZE infrastructure is built in Mexico. How much money was collected by South Coast AQMD through payment of mitigation fees and what was done with the funds collected. And the district should conduct a survey of warehouse owners, operators to collect information to help the development of an ISR. Next slide, please. That was a lot of information we covered in a few slides. Now is a good time to pause and reflect on the feedback we've received at the WWG meetings to date to make sure everyone is up to date on what has been discussed thus far. Specifically, What are some comments that resonated with you or you may disagree with that the WWG has shared? Additionally, what are some other important considerations that should be included in the development of a possible ISR or other potential strategies to reduce truck emissions? Please use the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you have a question or comment, or dial *9 if participating via phone. You may also post your question or comment using the chat below.
See, Jenny Quintana, for the purpose of just making sure everybody is aware of the comment that Jenny Quintana noted in the chat that she liked the suggestion to focus on warehouses near vulnerable persons and communities, but 1,000 feet may not be enough. So thank you for the comment, Jenny. Appreciate it. Are there any other questions or comments on this particular section? We have 2 more sections to go, so there's more opportunities to provide comments or feedback to us if you don't have anything right now. I think we'll go ahead and move on to the next section then. So next slide, please. Okay. So it's important to keep in mind that state and federal agencies have recently adopted substantial regulations that will transform the trucking sector to zero emission over the next few years, regardless of indirect source emission control strategy the district might end up pursuing. For example, starting in 2036, manufacturers may sell only zero emission medium and heavy duty vehicles in California under a state regulation called the Advanced Clean Truck Regulation. Another important regulation that will support this effort, which was covered in January's WWG meeting, was an update from CARB on their Advanced Clean Fleets Regulation, or ACF. The ACF regulation has 4 components: 100% ZEV sales requirement, and additional in-use requirements for drayage trucks, priority fleets, and state and local government fleets. Drayage trucks are in-use Class 7 and 8 on-road vehicles that transport containers and bulk goods to and from seaports and intermodal rail yards. As of January 1st, 2024, only zero-emission drayage trucks could register in truckers. Per the ACF requirements, all drayage trucks entering seaports and intermodal rail yards are required to be zero-emission by 2035. High priority and federal fleets may purchase either ZEVs or near zero emission vehicles, or a combination of zero emission vehicles and near zero emission vehicles until 2035. However, starting in that year, 2035, only ZEVs would meet the requirements for ACF in those high priority and federal fleets. California state and local government fleets, including city, county, special districts, and state agency fleets, would also be required to ensure 50% of the vehicle purchases are zero emissions beginning in 2024, and 100% of vehicle purchases are zero emission by 2027. The advent and implementation of ACF will result in ZEV trucks being utilized in many fleets in the coming years, regardless of whether an ISR rulemaking ends up being adopted or not. Determining the impact of an ISR would have above and beyond what ACF might be able to provide in terms of emission reductions is difficult to quantify and is something the district is still trying to determine in the months and years ahead. Next slide, please. Another important aspect of any regulatory rulemaking is tracking the status of ongoing litigation surrounding the only warehouse ISR rule in existence nationwide, which is Rule 2305 as found in South Coast AQMD. The regulation has been in litigation since it was adopted several years ago around claims of federal preemption violation with their local rulemaking. South Coast Rules 2305 and Rule 316 that supports it, lawsuits were filed by the California Trucking Association and Airlines for America. The lawsuits claim that South Coast AQMD rules exceeded the Air District's authority, were preempted by federal law, and imposed an improper regulatory fee. In December 2023, we received an update about this lawsuit, noting that the federal judge denied all motions made by the plaintiffs, effectively siding with South Coast AQMD's approach in their rules in the summary judgment for the lawsuit. While the judgment was found to be in AQMD's favor, it's possible that further lawsuits could be filed or appealed, including the potential for litigation if and when EPA acts to either approve or deny Rule 2305 from being enforceable at the national level. As mentioned, the outcome of the South Coast AQMD litigation will help inform any potential local regulation, and keeping tabs on the status of this effort is critical to ensuring any possible ISR in San Diego County would be done in a legally sound manner. What is clear is that the further San Diego or any other air district may stray from the South Coast model at this point in time that the court has seemingly approved of to date could run the risk of local litigation as well for any particular rulemaking, which could delay implementation of that rule, emission reductions achieved by that rule, or even in some cases close some pathways for other air districts who may want to take similar approaches if litigation is not found in the district's favor. Next slide, please. At the March Warehouse Working Group meeting, we also discussed possible ways the district could prioritize impacted communities for a regulatory approach for warehouses. One concept might be to have warehouses in these areas be required to accrue more points in order to comply with any possible rulemaking. In the South Coast rule model, facilities accrue points in many different ways, some of which include ZEV or near zero emission equipment or installing solar, for example. By having a facility located in an impacted community be required to accrue more points than a facility outside of that community, it would ensure that most benefits are realized in those areas. Another concept which is similar to this would require warehouses in impacted communities to comply faster with a possible rule that facilities might be located outside of those communities. Doing so would ensure any benefits would be achieved as expediently as possible and not overly burden other areas that may not have as great a need to reduce emissions right away. Another concept might be to modify the point system of possible compliance methods, so warehouses would accrue more points by purchasing or using ZEV trucks. Doing so could enhance the ability for these facilities to get into the cleanest technology possible faster than anticipated by state regulations, especially in the most polluted areas. And finally, the district might be able to explore potentially reduced registration and/or permitting fees for such warehouses if they could demonstrate they went above and beyond any compliance requirements associated with a possible local rule. For example, if a facility in an impacted community were to demonstrate that they accrued more than the required number of points in a given year, if the facility also had permits with APCD for other equipment, APCD might be able to explore reduced permitting fees for doing their part to reduce emissions above and beyond what is required. This concept would require further internal discussions amongst APCD staff to assess the possible district cost recovery and equity implications. On possible concepts for warehouses in impacted communities for a non-regulatory approach being developed, one concept might be to offer the facilities first-in-line privileges on any incentive funding being offered. This would ensure that incentive funding offered to such entities would be directed to the areas that need it most. An additional concept might also be to have higher incentive funding levels for warehouses in impacted communities, whereas a facility located outside of an impacted community might not receive as high as grant amount. It should be noted that all of these concepts require further thought and exploration, as well as to ensure that all of them would be legal avenues to pursue, especially in the case of any regulatory approach. Next slide, please. Another concept we wanted to highlight in this presentation is the information shared with us by Caltrans on the possible future Calexico border appointment and reservation system that is in the very early planning stages. However, if this concept is eventually implemented and found to be successful, it could prove to be a model that could reduce emissions from more efficient operations at the international border, and being able to tie such systems to other ports and intermodal rail yards. This concept was mentioned and supported by the IBC Steering Committee within the adopted SERP as Heavy Duty Vehicle Strategy 2, which set forth to implement programs that support efficiency in operations at the ports of entry to reduce wait times and reduce emissions from heavy-duty trucks. The proposed system would aim to close the existing communications gap for relaying traffic information for cross-border travelers by installing a microwave communications connection between the U.S. Customs and Border Protection in Calexico and the regional Caltrans Transportation Management Center located in San Diego. If funded, the system would relay border conditions such as wait times and incident information to border crossers through a mobile application. In doing so, the traveling public would be able to easily access real-time traffic conditions and could plan their trips accordingly. Notifying the public of incidents ahead of time would promote safety and efficiency by warning users of areas to avoid or take caution around, and would potentially result in more efficient movement of trucks and less vehicle idling. Caltrans' proposed feasibility study will develop a concept for a joint operations system for the Calexico East Port of Entry, which will also debut the first land port of entry appointment systems for commercial vehicles and potentially passenger vehicles. Using the current border conditions, the system will allow commercial vehicle border users to pay for a designated appointment window to cross the border. This first-in-the-nation application would be piloted initially for commercial vehicles and could be expanded to passenger vehicles. If successful, the pilot project in Calexico could have the potential to be scalable by expanding to other ports of entry and could be utilized at other ports of entries along the northern and southern borders in the United States. The system will expand upon appointment systems that are currently being used at the nation's seaports and introduce proven technologies to land ports of entry. Stakeholders in the Warehouse Working Group expressed that development of such a system in San Diego County ports of entry could have equal or greater emission reduction impacts that a possible ISR could achieve. The district will consider how such a model could be incorporated into any possible rulemaking to acknowledge the emission reductions that fleets could be achieving by participating in such a system. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, the district is still weighing all available options about whether to pursue an indirect source rule. However, if an ISR was developed using the South Coast Rule 2305 as a model, simply requiring fleets to use zero-emission trucks would not be a legally sound pathway. Instead, companies would have to select from a menu of options or pathways in order to accrue wear points year to year to demonstrate compliance with a potential rule. These options may include the acquisition of low NOx or zero emission trucks, low NOx or zero emission truck visits, zero emission yard trucks acquisition or use, zero emission charging or fueling infrastructure, which include electric charging or hydrogen station installation and use, solar panel system installation and use, air filtration systems, which may be installed at sensitive receptors within some distance from a warehouse, and a mitigation fee, which may be used to provide incentives toward the purchase of low NOx or zero emission trucks, as well as charging and fueling infrastructure. Next slide, please. It's also useful and important to understand how companies are complying with South Coast AQMD's Rule 2305, since it has been on the books for a few years. AQMD released a report last year summarizing how the first year of implementation for the respective ISR was going. The link to that report is on this slide. The results can potentially tell us how affected companies might respond and comply if a potential rule is developed in San Diego County. Here are the main takeaways from that report. Warehousing entities are complying utilizing a variety of menu options offered in the WARE program, which, as I mentioned, is a critical aspect to the rule being upheld in court. Around 2/3 of the total WARE points accrued in the first year of the program came from utilizing compliance options that likely did not require equipment to be purchased, and instead relied on facilities likely using zero-emission yard trucks and near-zero equipment technology that is readily and commercially available. About 4% of the total points accrued were from ZEV truck purchases, indicating facilities are complying using other means. And less than 2% of the points accrued in the first year were from solar panel use and installation, and a fraction of that was from air filter installs and purchases, indicating both are not likely to be heavily used options to comply with other rule requirements. Finally, while the mitigation fee option was utilized by companies subject to the rule, it didn't necessarily equate to those companies accruing the most points for using that option, likely signaling companies might be utilizing it as part of a suite of measures to comply. Next slide, please. While assessing the first year of data is useful, there are other considerations and caveats that should be elevated to ensure the data is looked at in the right context. This data was only for the first year of reporting and only for warehouse facilities above 250,000 square feet in size. Since Rule 2305 is phased in over a 3-year period, it's likely companies may need to morph and change their compliance methods as time goes on. Additionally, since this data is only applicable to larger facilities, the results in compliance options being used for larger facilities might not correspond to smaller facilities. For example, many smaller facilities may not have yard trucks on site, likely limiting what options may be available for a smaller company to comply. The aspect of pending litigation over the first year of rule implementation also likely played a factor in how companies complied with the rule. It's likely that with the aspect of looming litigation, companies may not have been willing to make significant investments in equipment without more certainty the rule would be upheld. While the rule was upheld for now, it's likely the dynamic may persist in future years, as it's possible the decision may be appealed or a new lawsuit is filed. Additionally, compliance options that may require longer lead times, such as infrastructure and ZEV truck purchases, could have been in process at the time of reporting in the first year, but may not have been completed yet. Future years of data reported will indicate if such purchases increase or not. Next slide, please. In terms of APCD's non-regulatory strategies, APCD also presented a preliminary tiered approach we intend to pursue to incentivize emission reductions from warehouses and distribution centers in a more timely manner than any rulemaking could provide. The first non-regulatory approach would involve incentivizing new ZEV truck purchases in under-resourced communities by amending our existing portside short-haul zero-emission truck pilot program. This would expand funding opportunities to warehouse entities and trucking companies that operate in under-resourced communities outside of the portside area, where the program is only allowed to fund at this present time, and allow them to purchase new ZEV trucks. An amendment to the existing program would require Community Steering Committee and CARB approval prior to implementation. The second non-regulatory approach, which already exists today through our Clean Air for All grant program, would continue to incentivize infrastructure purchases for new ZEV charging opportunities for warehouse and trucking companies. The program allows for the installation of infrastructure serving trucks up to $1 million with no cost-effectiveness limits and has a sliding scale for the grant received. Private infrastructure projects can receive between 50 to 65% of the cost paid for, depending on if it has solar or wind systems incorporated, and publicly accessible projects can receive between 60 to 75% of the cost paid for. Lastly, if an ISR rule would be developed in the future through a regulatory approach, and mitigation fees were collected as a method for compliance with that rule, APCD would then consider expanding the zero-emission truck pilot program to ensure warehouses, entities, and trucking companies that are operating outside of under-resourced communities would then be eligible to apply for new ZEV trucks, provided such equipment was surplus to existing regulations. The expansion of the program would also require Community Steering Committee and CARB approval. Next slide, please. So again, that was a lot of information, but we'd now like to pause the presentation again to see if there are any questions or comments at this time. What are some elements that you'd like or dislike in the possible regulatory and non-regulatory approaches that we outlined today? And what additional ideas should be considered? And do you prefer a regulatory or non-regulatory approach or both concurrent to one another. So if you have any, feel free to raise your hand if you have any comments, or you can put them in the chat.
Buenas tardes, soy Wendy Barrientos. Mi pregunta es, ¿cuándo empezarían todas estas estrategias a implementarse en las comunidades? ¿Serían hasta que se aprueben los budgets o cuándo? ¿Cuándo se estima? Gracias.
Yes, thank you for the question. We're going to be touching that on the last section, but what we're talking about exploring in terms of these strategies is if we're talking about a rulemaking, we would be looking to go to our board likely in September of next year is kind of our target. If we were taking the regulatory approach, if we're taking the non-regulatory incentive programs, those things are some of those programs are open now in the case of infrastructure, so that is definitely available when we have the funding available. In some cases, we would have to go to CARB and the steering committee to amend those existing funding programs to encourage ZEV trucks. So it's kind of a mix, but you'll be seeing some things happening over the next year or two, and we'll cover that a little bit more in the following section of the presentation. I see Nicholas Paul.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for the presentation.
Gracias.
You know, I think both the regulatory and non-regulatory approaches can work together. I like the idea of, I guess, like a step up incentive funding for facilities that are operating in disadvantaged communities. I think that's key. You know, we need to start where the pollution is impacting folks the most. I wonder if there's a way to kind of create like some additional nuance in that. So like, you know, I think maybe larger multi-million-dollar companies that are operating in these facilities maybe shouldn't have the same level of access to these funds as maybe like a small mom and pop shop that maybe has one or two trucks. And so like, I think there's maybe some room to kind of refine the incentive amounts and making sure that, you know, we aren't funding multi-billion-dollar companies' electrification of fleets, you know?
Yeah, that's a great comment, Nicholas. We have toyed with that idea, and you know, we haven't come forward with any kind of you know, nothing is set in stone, I guess, yet with the concept that we laid out in the incentive approach. But that is something that we have thought about and could incorporate. It's something that we understand where that comment we would go. We want to help the fleets and the companies that need the help the most, and that I think what you described would do that. I guess it's just at that point, if that's something that we would incorporate, is that something that would be acceptable to the steering committee, since something like that with any incentive program that we take would require CSC approval as well as CARB's approval. But provided they would be accepting of those, that's certainly something that we can explore. And it's something we've talked a little bit about in our warehouse working group as well, as a possible approach to fund the companies and that really truly need the help the most. So thank you for the comment. Shalem, do you want me to read the comments in the chat, or?
Yeah, if you can, so that just
Okay.
to make sure folks on the Spanish channel can hear too.
Got it. Okay. So I see Nicholas Powell had a comment. He said, I've heard that even the ACF regulation, 2/3, even with the ACF regulation, 2/3 of the heavy duty trucks in San Diego County will still run on gas and diesel through 2040. I believe a strong ISR is needed to help clean up the air faster because ACF alone will not get us there. There are lots of non-priority fleets that aren't covered by the ACF regulation, especially in disadvantaged communities like the port side. And then Nicholas linked to a report that projects San Diego County's heavy duty and medium duty truck inventory through 2040. And it looks like it links to a SANDAG document. So I would encourage everyone, oh, it's a blueprint document. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at that in the chat, in that link that Nicholas posted. Thank you, Nicholas. Jose Marquez wrote in the chat that he encourages us to reach out to Bruce Tudor from the California Air Resources Board, and that he has a lot of experience with the clean freight rule and zero emission strategies as they relate to the cross-border freight. Thank you, Jose. We'll definitely try and get in touch with Bruce. And then Kathy looks like said the same thing as I just did. So and I think I'm caught up there. Is there any other comments or questions at this time? We have one more section to go through, and I really appreciate everybody hanging in there. This is a lot of material to cover, so we're almost done though, I promise. If there are no comments at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Randy to bring us home here.
Thank you, Nick. At the October 2023 Governing Board meeting, the district proposed two parallel development timelines, one for possible regulatory approaches and one for possible non-regulatory approaches. The following are key milestones for both the regulatory and non-regulatory timelines. We'll look at the tentative regulatory timeline first. September 2023, staff convened an introductory orientation meeting, which was held virtually via Zoom with potential WWG participants. November 2023, staff convened the WWG kickoff meeting, and from that point on, staff continued to have monthly meetings of the WWG that dived into specific topics in great detail. Staff briefly discussed a few of these topics today, as well as the comments generated from these sessions. However, we again encourage CSC participants to review the recordings of each WWG meeting on our website to ensure community members are informed about topics that we were not able to present today. The regulatory timeline has the WWG meetings wrapping up as originally planned sometime this summer, with the district determining a proposed strategy and then presenting that to the Planning and Policy Committee or the Governing Board for an update later this year. If the proposed strategy involves a local ISR, and as directed by the board, the district will continue with the rulemaking process. A contractor will then begin preparing the required CEQA and SIA reports for this ISR project, which would take about 12 months to complete. A draft of the ISR will then be prepared for public workshop tentatively in spring 2025 while the CEQA work is concluding, and then submit the proposed ISR to the Governing Board for consideration in September 2025. Upon adoption, the district will direct efforts on implementation of and compliance with the ISR and continue stakeholder and public outreach. Next slide, please. The process for how a rule is ultimately developed is summarized on this slide, in case community members are not familiar with the process and where there are opportunities for engagement, feedback, and comment. First, the need for a new rule or for a revision of an existing rule is identified. This may come from federal, EPA, or state CARB mandates, state law, district requirements, or other sources. The process begins with the background phase, which includes conducting research, identifying affected sources, evaluating possible control options, and gathering input from various stakeholders. It's important to note that the district is still in the very early stages of evaluating the need for potential ISR for warehouses and distribution centers, as denoted by the red star on the slide. Based on the results of this research, the feasibility of moving forward with a rule proposal is determined based on technological feasibility, cost effectiveness, or emission reduction potential. If the proposal is deemed feasible, rulemaking staff then develop draft rule language and solicit additional input from stakeholders by conducting one or more public workshops. This would also involve outreach and respective presentations to the respective AB 617 steering committees to ensure their voices are heard as well. A response to comments report is then prepared, addressing all comments and questions raised at the workshop, and the report is distributed to interested parties and posted on our website. The draft rule is also revised as needed, depending on the comments received. Rulemaking staff must also then finalize supplementary supporting documentation for rules to comply with state law, including a socioeconomic impact assessment, SIA, and an environmental analysis to comply with the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, review. SIAs, for those unaware, are required by state law to evaluate possible impacts on employment, regional economy, costs, and industries affected. A board letter package is then prepared and submitted to the governing board for consideration of adoption of the proposal. If adopted by the governing board, the rule is then typically submitted to CARB and EPA for further approval, which could take months to several years to fully approve. The total length of time the rule development process takes will vary depending on the complexity of the rule proposal. For example, a straightforward amendment of an existing rule may take up to 1 year to complete. A new proposed ISR may require more time to develop. Next slide, please. Concurrent to the regulatory timeline, the following is the tentative non-regulatory timeline the district presented to the governing board back in October. This timeline was developed to encourage non-regulatory actions in a shorter time frame so affected stakeholders and community members could benefit sooner if such actions were taken on a voluntary basis. For the past 8 months, staff identified and discussed various potential non-regulatory and incentive strategies with WWG members and are now considering a proposed tiered approach of revised incentive programs that will encourage quick emission reductions and ZEV truck purchases. While the WWG will continue discussing other potential non-regulatory and incentive approaches, staff will continue to refine the existing concept which you heard briefly about today. By the end of the year, staff plans to fully develop a non-regulatory strategy, start implementation, and tentatively update Planning and Policy Committee on the overall status of the approach. Next year, staff plans to continue with non-regulatory strategy implementation and provide an implementation update to the governing board in September 2025. Next slide, please. To conclude our presentation today, we did want to highlight some important resources for CSC members to take advantage of. Last year, the district launched a new webpage dedicated to the WWG process, which provides resources for upcoming meetings, including the agenda and bilingual presentation slides. The district also created a bilingual fact sheet to provide easy-to-understand information about indirect sources of air pollution and their impact on under-resourced communities. Staff also developed a new WWG email subscription service, which will be the primary platform used to notify participants and other interested stakeholders about meeting updates. We invite any interested parties to subscribe using the link provided and selecting Warehouse Working Group WWG Meeting Updates under subscription topics. The public may also request to be added to the subscribers list by contacting district staff. In addition, recordings of all WWG meetings are maintained on the district's YouTube page. Subsequent recordings are posted following each meeting. Next slide, please. And now's the time we'd like to hear from you again. Do you have any other final questions, comments, or feedbacks you'd like to share before we wrap up today?
as people are, I know we're getting close on time at the end of the meeting, and we covered a lot of material today, but I did just want to reiterate that me and Randy and the entire APCD team is available to answer any questions at any point. This is not the only opportunity for comments, questions, feedback on this topic. We do plan on coming back to this committee at a point in time where we have a better, clear direction on where we're heading in terms of regulatory and non-regulatory options. And as you heard from Randy in today's presentation, there are lots of opportunities in between once if we start taking a formal rule development process where there'll be more opportunities to have voices heard and your comments submitted as part of the entire process as well. So this is not going to be the end of the road by any means. This is really truly the beginning of the road of where we're going. So I did just want to make sure that that was clear as we're getting short on time here. But are there any last questions or comments at this point? I see Jenny posted in the chat that maybe we could post a summary of the warehouse working group meetings, that it would be hard for people to watch the whole meeting. They're pretty long and often full of technical detail from someone who attends them. And I do agree, Jenny, that we do get into some pretty detailed discussions with those. I do think we could probably provide summaries of the warehouse working group meetings. I know we've been kind of working on those behind the scenes and really haven't posted those on the website, but I think we could probably do that, and I think that's a good idea. So I think we'll look into doing that and getting those up on the website when we can. So thank you for the comment. I think that's a good idea. Any other questions? If not, I think I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Shalem. I'm not sure if there are other items on the agenda today after us, but I apologize if we went over time, but I do appreciate all the feedback that we heard today, and thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Nick and Randy, for the presentation tonight. I want to assure folks, I know this was a lot to take in. Want to assure folks that we'll continue to engage in these conversations here at the International Border Community Steering Committee. Even if Randy and Nick aren't able to join us, I want to be able to relay that information back to them. I'd like us to unpack a little bit more deeply in terms of regulatory and non-regulatory approaches, meaning regulatory being like mandatory menu of options being required for emission reduction, and then non-regulatory really meaning about people or companies having the ability to choose whether or not to apply for an incentive for emission reduction. So I want to unpack that a little bit more deeply. Perhaps the next time we meet, I know we're going to have an in-person meeting next time in May, where we're going to actually have a presentation from the folks at the City of San Diego regarding their tree planting program, which is directly connected to one community emission reduction program CERP strategy. So I just want to let you know that we'll continue to engage in these conversations, unpack it, and so we can ensure that we get those direct recommendations or preferences or priorities back to Nick and Randy, even if they're not able to join us every single evening every month that we meet. But we're the Office of Environmental Justice is committed to ensuring that your voice is continually heard as part of this process if you're not able to join the working group meeting. And so we will certainly continue that conversation. And Nick and Randy, if it's okay, we'll hope to relay more feedback that we hear from this group in upcoming meetings, because there's certainly a lot to unpack, and the suitcase is still pretty full in terms of figuring out like what are all these moving pieces. So that's our commitment. The last thing we really have on the agenda is in terms of if there's any community comments or feedback that or public comments that folks would like to share before we close out. Fantastic. So our next meeting is going to be in person. Like I said, we're going to focus on trees next month, but I'll also designate some time on the agenda as well to continue our discussion on this, so that we can, as a group, come up with some direct feedback after we've processed this a bit more, to Randy and Nick and the folks in rural development as well. So we'll be sending out these presentations to you all, because I know that there's a lot to uncover or to unpack, and a lot of information on the slides as well. So we'll be sending these slides to you, and then also expect an email from Lauren with the draft outreach materials that you all can provide feedback as well. So with that, I'm going to see if Domingo has any last comments before we head out.
Nothing from my end, just thank everybody for their continued participation and wishing everybody a great rest of your evening.
Thank you so much, Domingo, and thank you, everyone. Have a great night. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Good night. Buenas noches.
Gracias, buenas noches.